Ryan, Senator Turner, Representative Graham. We have a quorum.
Okay. Thank you. The first item on the agenda will be the approval of minutes from November 14th. I'd like to entertain a motion for the approval of the minutes. Second? Okay. All in favor? Aye. Okay. Minutes are approved from the November meeting. I was looking around for a former representative named Hank Hancock was running around here a while ago. And I don't know where that's Hank. Stand up there. Hank I believe you were the first chair of this committee. Is that right? Second chair of this committee. And 8 years ago, he left after serving 21 years in the General Assembly. He retired from the General Assembly. I ran for his seat and was one. And 8 years ago, the last meeting, December meeting 8 years ago, he invited me to sit up and here behind the desk and sort of listen to this committee. And he said, now, Gipper, being Representative of Franklin County, you've got to be aware of all these things that goes on. And so I wanted to recognize Hank. He was a great legislator, and he's been a true friend. And Hank, we're glad you're here today. Let's give Hank a hand of applause. The next item on the agenda is a briefing on the Region 6 non-emergency medical transportation contract. Now, the reason we have this is because back in October, when this was a hot issue, we got a request from the 4 senators from Jefferson County, Senators Saunders and Karam, Neal, and Shaughnessy, for this committee to look into this topic. Of course, as you know, this committee looks at a lot of different topics, but some of the topics are handled by other committees. And so the appropriate committee really did look into that situation, and it's been somewhat resolved to a point at this time, but I felt that the members of this committee should at least get an update of what has transpired, as simply as a courtesy to the senators who requested us to look into this, and also for our own edification. So we have Tom Hewlett with the staff on the program review is going to give us an update and overview of what has happened and where we stand at present time. So Tom, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning. As you noted, there have been some problems with the contract and the broker in Region 6 for Medicaid non-emergency transportation. I'm going to try to briefly summarize those problems this morning. For those of you who may need a short brush up, Medicaid non-emergency care transportation is provided through a brokered approach right now. We have one broker for each Medicaid region in the state, and that broker acts as a gatekeeper to ensure that only eligible clients are transported by transportation providers. The broker subcontracts with transportation providers. They may also act as a provider themselves. The payment to the broker is based on a capitated rate, a set rate per member per month within the region. It's based on the eligible population and the estimated number of rides per month. In Region 6, that Medicaid region is composed of Bullitt, Jefferson, Oldham, Shelby, and Spencer counties. In that region, the Coordinated Transit Group, CTG, was awarded the contract and began providing services July 1st of this year. They were the only firm that responded to the RFP for that region. The contract for Region 6 is a $6 million a year contract that's based upon a capitated rate of $5.43 per client per month, with an estimated population of roughly 90,000 clients. Service problems began fairly early on with this contract. The first month of service was July, and there were over 700 complaints in July. And between July 1st and November of this year, over 1,700 complaints were received from clients. The complaints involved failure to pick up clients that had called for a ride, the failure to return clients after they'd taken them to the doctor's office. A number of complaints came in that they were never given a return ride home. There were also a number of complaints about a rude and uncooperative attitude by the broker. Subcontractors also filed numerous complaints about the broker in this region. They complained that they were not being paid in a full or timely manner. CTG in return responded that the contract for Region 6 was inherently flawed. They stated that the capitated rate was based on a study done in 1999, and that rate was never adjusted for inflation. They also stated they felt the contract underestimated the number of rides per month that would be required to be provided. Now, the contract did include a clause that provided for an adjustment of terms after the first quarter of service. We talked with Finance Cabinet officials. They said that CTG was never able to provide data that was adequate to adjust the rates of the contract. Finance told us basically that the data CTG provided was just simply not up to snuff, and they could not base any adjustments in the contract on the data that they were provided. In October of this year, the first of a series of court actions occurred. On October 21st, 3 subcontractors filed suit against CTG in federal court to force them into involuntary bankruptcy. This was an effort to recoup payments that these subcontractors felt they were owed by CTG. On November 12th, the state filed with the same court to cancel their contract with CTG. Before either of these actions could be ruled upon by the court, on November 25th, CTG filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy and canceled their contract to provide brokerage services for Region 6. CTG completely stopped providing services midnight, November 30th this year. There's now an interim program in place until a new contract is awarded. This interim program, the subcontractors who are performing under this contract with CTG are continuing to provide the services they were providing, and they're currently receiving the same rates that they negotiated with CTG. The Transportation Cabinet is currently acting to validate client eligibility and to answer questions and problems, coordinating a lot of the effort with the subcontractors. We've talked with both the Transportation Cabinet, the Finance Cabinet, and several of the brokers or providers in the region. And the Transportation Cabinet reports that the number of complaints are down dramatically. And when we talked with the providers, they stated that they also are receiving fewer complaints and having fewer problems. They did note that one of the problems they're having is that they frequently get multiple calls from the same client, so that more than one provider will show up to pick up the same person. The providers we talked to say they think that's because of the poor reliability in the system beforehand, where clients weren't sure if they were going to be picked up or not. So they learned to call more than one time. Now they get several calls coming in for one person, and basically what happens is 1 or 2 of those providers may have to go away without a fare. But the real concern that the providers noted to us is that several of them have reported they're owed considerable amounts of money, that CTG owes them multiple thousands of dollars. And they're uncertain about when they're going to get their next payment. The way the contract is structured, payment is a month after service. So while CTG provided service through the month of November, the payment for that month won't be made until the middle of this month. Finance tells us that that payment will go to an escrow account, and the disbursement of that payment will be basically at the discretion of the bankruptcy court. That leaves several of the subcontractors that we talked to feeling less than comfortable about when they're going to get their payment in December and whether or not they're going to be able to recoup the cost they're incurring for providing services. Until the bankruptcy filings are completed, until a new contract is awarded, and Finance has told us they estimate that'll be hopefully sometime within the first quarter of the new year. Until those things occur, there is probably going to remain quite a bit of uncertainty about when payments will be made to the subcontractors. That's briefly the current situation in Region 6. I'd be happy to try to answer any questions you might have at this time.
Okay, does anyone have any questions to ask Tom? Yes, Representative Arnold.
What about the other region? Are they operating okay? Everything's okay with them?
Other regions have had some startup problems. I don't want to make it sound like every region has just gotten up smoothly, with the exception of Region 6. There have been problems here and there. I think Region 6 has had more than its fair share of problems, and with the bankruptcy of the broker, there's still quite a bit of uncertainty up there about when this is all going to play out. The broker has stated that they felt the contract was unworkable because of the low cap rate and the low estimate in the number of rides, but by the same token, the broker did seek out this contract, entered into it voluntarily, and there was a clause in the contract to adjust the terms. But because of the poor data, that couldn't be enforced.
Okay, Representative Ball.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just going to ask the same question about the other regions, because in my area, I've heard a number of complaints about subcontractors, Tom, that encounter some of the same problems, and the fact that some of their trips have been denied, and late payment and no payment.
I think there's probably going to be a number of complaints about any new system that comes into place. And the purpose of the capitated rate is to get that broker to provide as efficient a service as possible. They're going to try to restrain the number of rides because they're getting a flat rate per month. Now, in the past, where there wasn't that ceiling on the amount to be paid out and there wasn't that restraint on the number of rides, there may have been more freedom to give rides here and there. And I think in part some of the complaints are going to be the result of a new system and holding down the cost of the system.
Some of the problems is that some of the subcontractors have been approved by the broker, and then yet the broker has refused to honor that approval in some instances, and has denied payment, even though they authorized those trips, and very late payments. And it's just a constant problem. I'm sure I'm not the only one who's heard that.
I know there's some complaints coming in from around the state. Program Review did a study on that a couple of years back. I think any willing provider is allowed to participate in these programs, and I think if the brokers or the providers have problems, they should be able to get those addressed through either the Transportation Cabinet or the Finance Cabinet.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Colombo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is what we have done to notify the patients, the receivers of these services, or the 1,700 people who were complaining. What have we done to let them know that we are trying to correct this problem, that we care about them?
There was extensive testimony at the Health and Welfare Committee meeting last month, giving those people a chance to vent some of their concerns. When the interim program came into place, there were press releases, media announcements. There wasn't time, because of the short turnaround between the time that CTG filed bankruptcy and the interim program coming into place, there wasn't really time to send letters to every client out there, but they tried to do that through the press. And because the same transportation providers are continuing to provide the service, those providers have, in many cases, built up a relationship with some of those clients. And they don't need to call transportation. They know the people in their area that are going to be calling them for rides. And a lot of the word of mouth that went out was from the transportation providers to their clients. And from everything that we've heard, it seems to be working a lot better now.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, this thing turned on. Go ahead, Kate.
Mr. Hewitt, we had this problem for a while. I didn't have it on, okay. And I think Representative Ball was kind of in the situation I was. I know Senator Guthrie and I met in Bowling Green because Yellow Cab was going through. But the problem was transportation, and I don't know whether you found I may be overstating, but everyone did not know, because in a rural area, they weren't getting the news. It may be on the internet, it may be in the courier, and the people just wouldn't, they're not going to look at those classifieds or look at the small ad. But I haven't heard any problems lately. So maybe they have fixed it some way. But thanks, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Any other member have a question? I see none. Well, Tom, thank you very much for this. It brings us up to date. And as you mentioned, the Health and Welfare has looked into this, and Transportation Academy is aware of these issues, and hopefully everything's going to be resolved. The next item on the agenda is to vote on the committee report that was presented in the November meeting on public funding of gubernatorial campaigns in Kentucky and other states. Now, we had the report in November meeting. You may recall we had a full-day meeting that day, and we had a morning session and an afternoon session. And when we got around the afternoon, we didn't have a quorum here to adopt the report. So I'd like to entertain a motion now that we will just adopt the committee's report. Senator Stein?
Mr. Chairman, actually, I have a different motion than that.
Oh? What kind of motion do you have, Senator Stein?
Well, sir, generally, our committee does a very thorough job in a study, and I applaud certainly their effort. But I frankly would like to see a bit more thorough analysis of this issue. And specifically, I would like to see a deeper examination of the aspect of party spending and how that affects our elections that we have had and will have. And so for that reason, sir, I would actually make a motion that we ask the staff to more thoroughly examine that aspect of it and then add that to the report after they've made that examination. And I'm hopeful that they could do that, within the next month. But if they need 2 months, certainly we'd understand. But, sir, that would be my motion.
Steph, if you'd like to make a response to this? You feel...
We'll do whatever.
I know you will do whatever we request, but is there anyone else? I really don't have any aversion to that. If each of you know, yes, Senator.
I second the motion.
Okay. All right. Representative Palumbo.
Is this a time for discussion?
Sure.
I certainly understand what Senator Stein means, and I would be amenable to doing that. I do think it's great to gather as much information as possible, but I also think we could adopt, in my opinion, the report that we have and just make a motion to continue and add information to it. That would be my opinion.
Okay. Senator Stein.
Mr. Chairman, with all due respect to Representative Palumbo, I believe that by doing a more thorough examination on the issue of party spending, that in fact may alter some of the conclusions that are made in this body of the study. And as a result, I think there may actually be alternative conclusions drawn, thus rendering the existing report perhaps erroneous. So, with all due respect, I would submit that we need to have the thorough examination before we adopt the final product.
Anyone else? Okay. Anyone else want to comment? All right, let's all in. Let's call a roll. All in favor of the motion to hold off the report? Yeah.
Representative Arnold?
Let me explain my vote, Mr. Chairman.
Sure.
I was not here at the last meeting. I was in another conference. And I really had no problem with furthering the study. I just think this issue of all this money in campaigns really need to be studied. So I'll vote aye. Okay.
Representative Ball? Representative Butler?
Yes.
Representative Coleman? Representative Hoffman? Representative Palumbo? Representative Sims? I'm sorry.
She wanted to make a comment.
I wanted to make a comment on why I'm voting no. I do think, excuse me, that if we found out information that would alter the report, that we could say so at that time and go back and make the appropriate corrections. So I vote against the motion today.
Representative Sims?
I want to explain my vote, Mr. Chairman. I will vote yes to go along with it, and only because probably some of the boards that I think we had several meetings that day, and I was out and didn't really get to hear the discussion, but that's the only reason. But really, I agree with Representative Palumbo. I don't see why we have to prolong it, but today I'm going to vote yes.
Okay.
Senator Borders?
Yes.
Senator Guthrie?
Yes.
Senator Harris?
Yes.
Senator Herron? Senator McGahey?
Yes.
Senator Syme?
Yes.
Senator Stein?
Aye.
Senator Turner?
Representative Graham.
Well, I would agree with Representative Palumbo. I think we should move on with this thing. So I will say no. But I understand the rationale for it, and I just think we've given it enough attention so far, and I don't think it's going to be earth-shattering. Whatever we find out is not going to change the course of the world. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes. Let's see. Okay, the next item on the agenda is to have the presentation of the report on the cost, the benefits, and monitoring of Kentucky's enterprise zones. We have the staff here to make a presentation. We have Perry Nutt and Barry Boardman. So anyone else wants to come to the table?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. With me today are, of course, Barry Boardman here, and to my left is Mike Clark. We're with the LRC Staff Economist Office, and we were asked to look at Kentucky's Enterprise Zone Program. Today, we'd like to present our results of our report. Our presentation will cover 5 different areas. First, we'll give a little overview of the program. Then we'll review the Enterprise Zone programs in other states. And we'll describe the types and utilization of state tax incentives associated with the program. And we'll examine the economic changes that have taken place within the zones. And we'll discuss the monitoring issues associated with the program. House Bill 505 in 1982 established the Kentucky Enterprise Zone Program. The idea was that, or the purpose behind the program was to revitalize the depressed urban neighborhoods by offering tax incentives for firms located in or attracted to the zones. Now, the idea was that by offering tax incentives, this would stimulate new investment and employment within the zones. Now, the Enterprise Zone Program, go ahead. You need to advance. Go ahead. Go ahead. Now, the Enterprise Zone Program has 3 goals. The first goal is to improve the quality of life of zone residents. The second goal is to encourage economic activity of both new and existing businesses. And the third goal is to eliminate blighted and deteriorated areas. Now, in terms of oversight, the enabling legislation established the Kentucky Enterprise Zone Authority, which is attached to the Cabinet for Economic Development. There are 11 members who serve on this authority, and they serve 4-year terms. 8 of the 11 members are appointed by the governor, and the remaining 3 members are the Secretary of the Revenue Cabinet, the Secretary of the Cabinet for Workforce Development, and the Secretary of the Cabinet for Economic Development. Now, currently, Kentucky has 10 zones, which is the maximum number allowed, and each zone expires after 20 years from its designation date. The first zones that are set to expire are Hickman and Louisville, and they will expire at the end of 2003. Now, how did these areas originally qualify for designation as an enterprise zone? Well, they could qualify based on 2 different conditions. First of all, an area could qualify if it was one that had high unemployment and low income, or an area could qualify if it had experienced a declining population of at least 10%. Now, what firms are eligible to participate in the program? Basically all firms, both new and existing, are eligible to participate, but they do have to meet different requirements. For new firms, or those firms that have started operations after the zone was designated, in order for them to qualify, they must have 25% of their employees must meet the targeted workforce criteria. For existing firms, they have to meet somewhat different conditions, and they must meet one of 2 conditions. they can either qualify by increasing their capital investment within the zone by 20%, or they can increase their enterprise zone workforce by 20%, with 25% of these new employees required to meet the targeted workforce criteria. Now, what individuals make up the targeted workforce? First of all, they must be a Kentucky resident, and then they have to meet one of three conditions. They can either be a zone resident, or they must have been unemployed or on public assistance for the 3 months prior to being hired by an enterprise zone firm. Now, in terms of the incentives that are offered to firms in the enterprise zone program, for the qualified firms, or those firms that have met either the hiring requirement or the investment requirement, there are several incentives that are available. One incentive is a sales and use tax exemption on new and used machinery and equipment. There's also an exemption from the motor vehicle usage tax on commercial and non-commercial vehicles. There's also a corporate income tax credit that's equal to 10% of the wages paid to certain targeted workforce employees. Also, in addition, there's also a sales and use tax exemption on building materials, and this exemption is available to all firms within the zone, whether or not they participate in the program, and it's also available to all residents or property owners within the zone. And we examined or reviewed the enterprise zone programs in 14 states that Kentucky often competes with. All but 3 of these states have active state-run enterprise zone programs. The 3 states that we find that did not have a state-run enterprise zone program are Tennessee, Mississippi, and West Virginia. Now, in reviewing the 11 states that have enterprise zone programs that we compete with, we found a few common characteristics. We found that 10 of the states, or almost every one of them, have a provision that sets the expiration date for the zones. Also, all of these states target economically depressed areas and have hiring and investment requirements. Also, all the states do grant certain tax incentives, and they typically link these tax incentives to the number of jobs created or the level of investments made. Now, what are some of the unique characteristics?
Excuse me, we have a Representative Palumbo wants to interject a question at this point.
I just want to make sure I understood you. When you're talking about the enterprise zones in other states, you said Mississippi, Tennessee, West Virginia did not have zones.
They don't have a state-run enterprise zone program. Yes, that's correct.
Thank you.
Okay, continue.
Now, what are some of the unique characteristics or some of the differences that we noted across these 11
One
states?
other interruption here. I got
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to make sure I'm following this, okay? Because we've got the counties here, and I want to make sure I'm following along and I'm understanding what you're saying to us. How did Hickman, Louisville, Ashland, how did they become a Kentucky enterprise zone? Kind of get down to the elementary part of it and just give me a little background of what's happening here.
Sure. Back when the legislation was first passed in 1982, the legislation specified that there could be 7 zones across the state. A few years later, that limitation, or they passed legislation that allowed 10 zones throughout the state. 10 zones throughout the state. In order to be qualified as a zone, they have to meet one of 2 conditions. They either had to have an area that had high unemployment or low income, or they had to be an area that had experienced declining population of at least 10%. So they had to meet one of those 2 conditions to be designated.
Mr. Chairman, just indulge with me just a few minutes. The only one I could see, and maybe I'm confused, but it's just thinking right off, Hopkinsville, Louisville should have a high employment rate. Clarify a little bit.
Okay,
Why-
these zones are not the city itself, but certain parts within the city.
Okay, Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, continue on.
And what are some of the unique characteristics that we found in looking at these different states? We found that 5 states do restrict the type of businesses that are eligible for the benefits. And for these 5 states, we found that primarily they use their program to target manufacturing firms. We also have found that 4 states do have a minimum investment requirement before a firm could take advantage of the credits offered or the incentives offered. There's also several states that offer both a corporate income tax credit as well as a training credit for employees. Overall, I think the most notable difference when examining these other states was that Kentucky appears to offer a wider range of exemptions pertaining to the sales and use tax exemption, and that Kentucky doesn't restrict the type of businesses that can participate in the program. So that was the major difference that we found. Another objective of our study was to examine the costs associated with the program. Now, obviously, the direct costs of the program are the tax revenues foregone. First, we'll talk about the tax incentives, which are, of course, the corporate income tax credit, the motor vehicle usage tax exemption, and the sales and use tax exemption on building materials and machinery and equipment. And we'd like to note that there are 2 sources of data that do keep track of the cost of the enterprise zone program. There's data that's collected by the Kentucky Revenue Cabinet, and there's also data that's collected by the Kentucky Enterprise Zone Authority. And we're going to start off by looking at the Revenue Cabinet data first. This pie chart here contains information from the Revenue Cabinet pertaining to the Enterprise Zone program, to the incentives specifically. The total reported incentives since 1993 have been $169 million, or about $16.9 million on an annual basis. You'll note that in this graph or in this pie chart that the sales and use tax exemption makes up the majority of the incentives, about 79% that have been taken, followed by the motor vehicle usage tax exemption, which came in at 19%, and a corporate income tax credit has only been 2% of the total. Now, for the corporate income tax credit, you'll note that only a few firms have taken advantage of this. And I think there's a couple of reasons why we've had such a low participation rate. First of all, before a firm can take this credit, they must have targeted workforce employees, and they also must have a corporate income tax liability. If you look at current statistics associated with the Enterprise Zone program, less than 50% of the qualified firms have targeted workforce employees, and therefore they could not take this credit. Also, I think new firms are not likely to have a corporate income tax liability, therefore they couldn't take the credit. And also, I think firms are not organizing as C corporations. I think the trend has been more towards LLPs or limited liability corporations and partnerships, and therefore they're not subject to this tax and they can't take this particular credit. This next slide does have some information pertaining to the motor vehicle usage tax exemption. You'll see from this slide that most of the vehicles qualifying for this exemption are commercial vehicles, not the non-commercial vehicles. Over the past decade or since 1993, the average annual number of vehicles which received an exemption has been around 2,500 per year. And the average amount of tax exemption has been $3.2 million per year. Now this next slide shows the sales and use tax exempted since 1993, and you see that the amount exempted has ranged from $18 million in 1993 to about $12 million for the most recent fiscal year. And overall, the average amount of the tax exempted per year has been about $13.4 million. In addition to the Revenue Cabinet data, the Kentucky Enterprise Zone Authority also collects data on an Enterprise Zone program. In January of 2000, the Cabinet amended the regulations to require firms to respond to their monitoring survey or that they would risk decertification by the authority. The information captured in the survey includes data on the type and the amount of investments made by each qualified Enterprise Zone firm. Based on the responses by these firms, KESA reports the amount of authorized exemptions. Now, based on this data, which covers the calendar year 2000, the enterprise zone firms reported making investments that would lead to $62 million in incentives. And I guess the question here is, why is there such a large difference between these two data sets? And I think there's two factors to keep in mind here. First of all, the Kentucky Revenue Cabinet data only captures sales made by Kentucky vendors, and whereas the Kentucky Enterprise Zone Association or Authority data may capture the out-of-state purchases made by enterprise zone firms. So based on the monitoring reports, you'll see that in this particular table that the data indicate that 78% of the credits were reported by enterprise zone firms in Louisville, followed by Lexington and then Ashland. Okay. Now, when looking at these costs or the tax incentive data, they represent the cost of the enterprise zone program. Of course, individuals and firms located in the zones may have benefited from the program as well. I think Barry will, in this next section, will review data from each of the 10 enterprise zones to determine if the economic status of the individuals living in the zones has improved.
What I want to reiterate again, when I talk about benefits here, I'm specifically
Excuse me, we have another question, Senator Steins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to confirm and get something straight in my mind. When you talk about the sales and use tax, that's the tax you pay when you buy the vehicle. That is different from the property tax,
Yes.
correct?
Uh-huh.
Okay,
Yes,
thank you.
that would be the motor vehicle usage tax when you buy the vehicle.
Thank you.
Okay, continue.
when I speak of benefits here, I'm really speaking of the benefits of the residents or the people that live in these enterprise zones. And what we tried to do to get at the economic well-being or benefits of these people, we brought in information on population, employment, poverty, income, and housing. And to do that, we had to look at the 1980, 1990, and 2000 census data to make this evaluation. We also included information on the counties within which these zones, these enterprise zones, were contained. One thing I want to note with respect to this analysis, looking at zones, is census tract boundaries and enterprise zone boundaries are different. This picture here shows an enterprise zone area that is in the kind of aqua blue or almost dark blue here, or green. I'm not sure what that color is up there. And the census tracts are outlined in black there. And what you see, in some cases, the zones and the tracts are one and the same, but in many cases, enterprise zones and census tracts will differ somewhat. The zone will be in part of the census tract. So what we had to do in those instances is we tried to eliminate any census tracts when less than 50% of the zone population was contained in that tract. We wanted to try to, as accurately as possible, portray the economic well-being of the residents of the zone, more so than just census tract data. The first information that we looked at was population. One of the major criteria that was used to designate a zone was a decline in population. So we were interested to see how since 1980 up to the 2000 census, what has happened with population. And what we find in general across these zones, that populations have continued to decline. The Knox-Whitley and Louisville 96 zone only have data from 1990 to 2000. Louisville, here you'll see, in fact, on this graph and the following four graphs, that Louisville was broken up into three separate areas. The original zone, which I labeled Louisville 83, is about a 3.8 square mile area. The total zone now is over 81 square miles, so it's grown to be quite a large zone. So I broke it up into three distinct areas. Louisville 86 represents the area that was expanded from 84 through 86. And Louisville 96 was included as the area that was expanded in 1996. The next information we gathered was on employment. And we looked at employment, and what I've shown here is the unemployment rate change. And we see that in general here, unemployment fell in these zones. Unemployment rate fell in these zones as well as in the counties with which these zones reside. The one thing to note here with respect to the unemployment rates, they still remain 2 to 3 times higher than the rest of the counties they're in. These zones do seem to follow a general trend that we've noticed with unemployment rates throughout this period, where unemployment rates were falling not only within these zones, the counties, but also the state as well. The next bit of information we looked at is income related. The first one was poverty, and the poverty rate in 6 of the 10 zones actually increased over this period. Where poverty rates did fall, it seemed like they fell at a greater rate in the rest of the county, and they still remain as much as 2 to 3 times higher than the rest of the county within which these zones reside. Another income-related bit of information.
Interject you. Representative Palumbo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Would you repeat the sentence before the last sentence, please?
I'll try to remember what that was. Let me just go back.
It was after you said the 6 out of 10 zones, the poverty level was still greater.
Yes, the poverty level still remains in these zones 2 to 3 times higher than the rest of the county within which these zones reside.
Then the sentence after that.
Let me check notes here.
Well, you were talking about,
Okay. Oh, well, that they where these poverty rates did decline,
Yes.
they still did not decline at as fast a rate or by as great amount as the rest of the county within which they resided as well.
but it did decline.
Yes, yes, and
In-
in actually 4 of the zones, 4 of the 10, there was a decline in the poverty rates.
Thank you.
Okay, continue.
The next income measure is median family income. Median family income is simply if you will, the middle income, family income within a zone or a census tract or whatever area that you're looking at. And when we looked at the median family income of the enterprise zone and compared that with the median family income of the rest of the county, we find that actually, in every case, the median family income decreased relative to the rest of the county. So the income of those residing in the zones was falling relative to the rest of the county within which those zones were in. The final bit of information we pulled together had to do with housing. And what we looked at here was the vacancy rate, number of housing units that weren't occupied. And again, we find that in the enterprise zones that in every instance, housing rates continue to increase. They also continue to remain at well over 2 times the vacancy rate of the rest of the county. And increasing vacancy rates could speak to, I can't say with certainty, but could speak to a declining housing market as opposed to an improving housing market. The main points or the main findings from looking at the economic well-being of residents is really that we can't establish any evidence from the census tract data of improved economic well-being for zone residents. And in general, we can also speak to the fact that zone residents do not appear to be any better off than they were before when compared to the rest of the county with which they're located. I'm going to turn it back over to Perry now.
Okay, thanks, Barry. After examining how zone residents may have been impacted by the Enterprise Zone program, we also wanted to consider how the Enterprise Zone firms may respond given the incentives offered by the program. And I think here the key relationship is in evaluating this program is whether the tax incentives do actually lead to new investment and employment within the zones. Basically, the incentive offered to firms is a 6% reduction in the cost of purchasing building materials, machinery and equipment, and vehicles. in the analysis that follows, we estimate what the potential economic effects might be given that firms increase their investment spending. The critical question is how much additional investment spending can you reasonably, or how much additional investment spending can be attributed to the enterprise zone incentive. I think research in this area indicates that perhaps the best case scenario is one where the firm spends all of its incentive dollars. In other words, for each dollar saved in taxes, the firm then increases its investment spending by a similar amount. The latest Kentucky Enterprise Zone Authority monitoring data, those reports indicate that approximately $60 million in tax incentives were taken by enterprise zone firms in 2000. Therefore, we developed our estimates of the economic effects, assuming that $60 million in new investment has taken place in Kentucky due to the enterprise zone program. Our analysis indicates that a $60 million increase in investment will lead to approximately $40 million in additional personal income. The bottom line is that a $40 million increase in personal income will lead to relatively small fiscal effects. We estimate that the income and sales tax effect associated with this increase in personal income would be $3.7 million. So I think if you compare the positive fiscal impact, the $3.7 million, to the cost of the program, the net fiscal impact of the program appears to be negative. Now, the last section that we'll present here examines some of the monitoring or some of the various monitoring issues associated with the program. And I think it's important to note that there's 3 different entities that have distinct monitoring roles with respect to the program. First of all, you have the Kentucky Enterprise Zone Authority that is responsible for approval of the original zones and the expansions. They also certify existing enterprise zone firms and the new firms. They also monitor firms each year. The Kentucky Revenue Cabinet does play a role in administering the enterprise zone tax incentives. And you also have the Department for Employment Services that serves as a certification entity for the targeted workforce employees, and they also certify the data pertaining to the original zones and any expansions that do take place. Now, one area is that since 1992, the zone expansions have had to independently meet the zone requirements. And in other words, expansion areas have to either be have high unemployment and low income, or they must have experienced a declining population. Now, what we found is that in a number of instances, the expansions that have been approved for areas with 0 population, and to us, it was not clear how these expansion areas met the zone requirements.
Question.
Yes.
I have a question here from Representative Arnold.
0 population, you mean they'd expand it into an area to build maybe a new industry or locate a new industry?
Yeah,
what was it?
I think that's what we found by and large when you look at these areas, these expansion areas that have been approved with 0 population, is that these are undeveloped areas and are typically industrial sites that they've gone, the zone has actually gone to this site or made a link to this site.
It would, I'm sure this be adjacent to a blighted area or to an enterprise zone area, aren't they?
Yeah, they're
contiguous?
continuous. Yeah, they're continuous, not contiguous, but continuous. Yeah, they are linked. Yes.
Okay. That's all.
Okay. Senator Syme has a question.
Yes, on the monitoring, I don't remember seeing a whole lot of reports coming down over the last 20 years as to who was monitoring what and when. Have they been effective at all? Or, I mean, are they actually monitoring? I mean, is it actually taking place?
Yes, there is some monitoring that is taking place, and actually, relative to other states, we're probably a little more advanced than some of the other states. And I think in the last 3 to 4 years, we've picked up our monitoring.
Okay, and who have they reported that to?
Pardon?
Who do they report to on this monitor? Where does this information?
We get an annual report, the LRC does, from the Kentucky Enterprise Zone Authority.
Okay. Is there and I can only speak to Jefferson County. In Jefferson County, there is an individual locally that basically, I'm not sure what his title is. Now, is he a state employee, or is he employed by the local?
He's employed by the local.
By the local.
Yes.
Is there, do we have, is there an impact, any kind of a study as to what kind of an impact that this had as far as taxes go at the local level?
No, not that I know.
So we don't really know what effect the enterprise zone has had, good or bad, at the local level?
At the local level, it's much more difficult to tell because the local data is a little sparser, actually.
But wouldn't that be the job of the fellow that's hired at the local level to kind of produce that?
I don't think they're charged with keeping track of that necessarily, the fiscal impact at the local level. What they're charged with is taking applications from the particular firms, forwarding those applications to Kentucky Enterprise Zone Authority for certification and those types of things.
See, I called in there, into that office a while back, and quite frankly, I didn't get the impression they did much of anything there. That was my impression of it, so I don't know. I guess my difficulty with this issue is that we don't really know what it does at the local level, at least, so.
Yeah, it's very difficult to make those estimates, yes, that's exactly right.
Thank you, Barry.
Another interjection here, Representative Barnum.
I may be getting ahead of you.
Okay.
But on this monitoring over on this issue, I believe it says that even homeowners are eligible for this 6%, no
Yes,
sales
that-
tax on repairing homes or so forth.
On building materials, that sales and use tax exemption for building materials is open to everyone within the zone. That's exactly right.
I would assume under this monitoring system, if a homeowner goes and buys $10,000 worth of building material, is it monitored that would be used on their home, or is there any abuses like that?
We're going to get to that pretty soon.
Okay.
Can you wait just a little?
I sure will. Okay.
But yeah, that is a problem. You're exactly right. That is a problem area.
We've got one other interjection here.
Okay.
Senator McGahey.
Just following up on the expansions here, I know, and going through the report, expansions that have been made on some of these zones, they have, you said many of them were continuous, but they're not really contiguous, which means that this expansion could have been made on down the road away from this zone, but it is continuous in that there is a narrow band of land that draws them together.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Do you have maps that we can look at these? I didn't.
If you look at page 59, do you have a copy of the report?
Yes, sir.
Okay, page 59.
Uh-huh.
You see that?
Yes, sir.
You see the link there. It's it's just a thin gray line going there that links these two areas. And that's how they met the continuous criteria associated with the zone. And I think in this particular case, what happened is that the city annexed an area, a very narrow area, to get to an industrial park outside of the city here. They annexed that area, and in the next census, that area is then included as a census tract boundary by the Census Bureau.
That's what Commissioner said, that's this little area right here. Is that the one they sent you at home?
Yeah. That's probably the difference.
Mr. Chairman, if I'd like to say, I thought I'd seen some gerrymandering before, but this outdoes anything the legislature's ever done.
Okay. Go ahead, Senator.
I think this is just a great example of how we can take a good program maybe and totally run it in the ground. But this, of course, comes in response to a limit of 10 zones. And when you can't have any more zones, you make the thin gray line connected. And the other zones, now this is a particular zone. This is where
Hopkinsville.
This is Hopkinsville, okay. Now, do we have similar things going on in other zones too?
There have been some other cases, yes, that's correct. I don't have maps or examples of those, but yes, that is correct.
Does anyone have maps?
Yes, we can get those for you if you want those, yeah. We'll be happy to provide those.
Okay. Senator Syme.
Yes, Barry. Just exactly what is a qualified business?
A qualified business is one that has been certified by the Kentucky Enterprise Zone Authority, and it can either be a new business or an existing business. If it's a new business, it has to meet a certain condition before it can become certified.
Can that be a non-corporation?
It can be
Any self-employed person? A person with wants to rehab a house? They have to make the application for it. Pardon? So, so basically any landlord that wanted to rehab.
if it has to do with buying building materials, then anyone within the zone, they don't have to be qualified. The qualified firms are only eligible to take the
A
sales.
homeowner?
Pardon?
A homeowner.
They're eligible to take the building materials exemption.
I think I'm going to shoot myself over this. I'm looking back over 20 years, and I've blown it.
Okay. Senator Stein. Oh, you finished, Senator? Okay, Senator Stein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In reference to the question that Senator Syme asked earlier about the monitoring and your response, I'd like to clarify in my mind what exactly you were saying. I think he asked, he didn't recall receiving reports or seeing regular monitoring. And I noticed on page 29 there's reference to the fact that the Cabinet for Economic Development in January actually amended its administrative regulations pertaining to the enterprise zone to provide an annual monitoring system. And it wasn't until there were actual penalties for failure to respond to that you actually got up to an 80% response rate. So prior to that, I get the impression, correct me if I'm wrong, that the monitoring that was done, if any, was sort of voluntary and haphazard. Is that correct?
The monitoring that was taking place during that time had to do with the certification of the targeted workforce employees, and so that was a continual monitoring that has been taking place since 1992. Now, with respect to gathering information on the investments made by the particular firms, qualified firms within each one of these zones, yes, you're correct. That activity didn't pick up until the last several years.
So in terms of any real data to be able to examine, we really only have very recent data. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Okay, continue.
Okay, where was I at now?
Okay, yeah.
We'll talk about some of the monitoring issues with respect to the new and existing businesses within the enterprise zones. Now, enterprise zone firms must have 50% of their employees performing substantially all of their services within the zone. And currently, the information relating to this requirement is self-reported by the firms. Our recommendation here is that the authority should decrease their reliance on this self-reported data, and they should try to develop a more effective process to verify this requirement. With respect to new businesses, remember that they must hire 25% of their employees from the targeted workforce. And our finding here was that the employment history and the participation in public assistance programs is being thoroughly checked. And there's also a procedure in place to check whether someone is a zone resident or not. We would like to make one recommendation, one relatively minor recommendation, is that there probably could be a small improvement in checking the residency status. So we would recommend that the authority and the Department for Employment Services cooperate to strengthen the verification of this requirement. Now also in order to ensure that the 25% targeted workforce requirement is met by new firms, one has to have information regarding total employment by these firms. At the present time, information on total employment is also self-reported by the enterprise zone firms. I think here our recommendation is that the authority should work with the Department of Employment Services to utilize their existing employment databases to verify the total employment of the enterprise zone firms. Now, existing firms, of course, we mentioned earlier that they typically qualify for the program by increasing their investment within the zone by 20%. So currently, the authority does not check to make sure that these investments are actually made, other than receiving a report from the firm indicating the type and the amount of the investments. Once again, this self-reported data we think should probably be augmented by additional procedures to verify that the investments in these zones actually do occur. Yes.
Okay, you have a question here. Yes.
Just real quick, is there any evidence that firms are misreporting that? I mean,
No, no.
I just wonder how prevalent that is. You
That's-
create a whole regulatory structure trying to audit firms. Do they sign the form saying that they under perjury or whatever penalty if they do that?
I'd have to check that and see, but yeah, they do sign the form.
Yeah, I just wonder if you could audit and re-audit. I mean, there should be some
Yeah.
checking, but just
I'd have to check that and see, but yeah, they do sign the form.
yeah, I just wonder if you could audit and re-audit. I mean, there should be some
Yeah.
checking, but just every time you do one, you get audited. Would
Certainly, I
probably
don't
be
think they could go
cumbersome.
out and check every firm, but they could probably go out and spot check firms or do a random checks of firms.
Right, right. I would just see something could get pretty cumbersome.
Yeah, you wouldn't, you don't want to spend so much money on monitoring the issue that you're spending more money than actually what you're saving in that particular case.
Okay, Senator Stein has a rejection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the study, did you, or were you able to distinguish between instances where businesses might be eligible to take a sort of machinery deduction, if you will, because of another tax incentive that's available to them, but that they in fact might attribute that deduction to enterprise zone simply because it's easier to report it that way rather than go through whatever other restrictions might be on taking it another route, thus artificially inflating the apparent cost of the enterprise zone?
Yes, that's a very good question, an excellent question. It's one that we couldn't really get at because we don't have that individual firm level information to make those determinations. But you do bring up an interesting point, is that currently these firms may be taking the exemption under the 154, Section 154, KRS 154. If the zones were not to exist, then they would have available to them a statewide exemption. It's covered in 139, KRS 139.17, I believe, which is a new, and that particular statute is for new and expanded equipment. So it's a somewhat narrower exemption, but yes, some of the exemptions that are being taken right now, if the zone goes away, they could also take that. They would just simply move to a different exemption and take that credit that way.
Okay, continue.
Okay, thank you. Now, what are some of the monitoring issues associated with the tax incentives associated with the enterprise zone program? First of all, our findings indicate that there are effective monitoring procedures in place to examine or to monitor the corporate income tax credit. Also, primarily, or for the most part, the motor vehicle usage tax has sufficient monitoring procedures in place. However, our concern here is that ensuring that vehicles are used solely for business purposes, and that presents more of a challenge. I think our conclusion with respect to this particular exemption is that it probably wouldn't be cost effective to closely monitor this requirement. In other words, we think the increased monitoring expense may actually exceed any tax savings that you would get from the reduced exemptions. Now, with respect to the sales and use tax exemptions, remember that applies not only to building materials, but machinery and equipment as well. And for building materials, like we've said before, it's available to anybody within the zone. The key issues here, I think, are making sure that firms and property owners outside of the zone do not receive this exemption. The second issue or monitoring issue associated with building materials is ensuring that materials are used within the zone. The third monitoring challenge is making sure that building materials are not used for normal repairs and maintenance. And in terms of how this process actually works, at the time of purchase, the purchaser presents an exemption certificate to the vendor, and then this certificate does capture the information regarding the purchaser's name, the amount of the purchase, and where the materials will be used at. However, we think that there's probably very little incentive for vendors to closely scrutinize this information, and along with affirmation by the purchaser that this is not an effective safeguard to limit the abuse of this exemption or the potential abuse of this exemption. Given that, we would recommend that the Revenue Cabinet and the authority investigate alternative procedures for this particular exemption that do not rely on the vendors. Now, for the last particular exemption that we have is the machinery and equipment purchases, and again, only qualified firms, enterprise zone firms that have been certified by the authority are eligible to take this exemption. Our finding here is that there's an effective procedure to make sure that only qualified firms do receive this exemption. However, I think our concern here with this particular exemption is that similar to the building materials exemption, the vendors serve as the judge or the gatekeeper regarding whether the items purchased are eligible for the exemption. Our recommendation here is that the Revenue Cabinet and the authority investigate alternative ways to provide this exemption rather than relying on the vendors. Finally, to summarize our main findings or conclusions, we have three. And first of all, from the census analysis or the analysis of the data relating to each particular zone, and in looking at those in total, we find that there's little evidence that zone residents have experienced an improvement in their economic well-being. On the second conclusion is that while the enterprise zone firms and the zones themselves have benefited from the tax incentives, I think the costs have been at least $169 million over the past decade, and it appears that the incentives have not led to substantial increases in investment within the zones. Also, concerning our last part of our presentation here, you've seen that the current structure of the program looks to possess a number of monitoring challenges which could result in program abuse. And with that, turn it back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, we are going to, okay, we'll have your question. Let me mention to you, we do have a response from the cabinet. So if you'd like to hold your questions to then or have it now. So, Senator?
I have a question right now, if I may,
Sure.
Mr. Chairman. The question is, in your first conclusion, you say little evidence that the zone residents have experienced an improvement in their economic well-being. Okay, I understand that, but what if we didn't even have the zones? Would they be in even worse shape than they are right now? We may not have been able to improve them much, but without the zones, they'd be in worse shape. So I'd like to get your response to that, and then when the cabinet comes, to get their response.
Okay. Yeah, you're exactly right, and it's hard to disentangle that effect, but and I think that could have occurred. We could actually see an even greater deterioration in these zones if the program didn't exist. I think what our analysis indicates is that whatever small benefit or whatever benefit the zone may have had in slowing down that deterioration, that benefit has not been large enough to offset all the other negative impacts in those particular areas. So what you've seen is still a widening gap between the zones and the rest of the county.
So are we throwing good money after bad, or are we? I mean, I guess that's a judgment that you're not willing to make, judging by your response.
Well, ultimately, it's not really clear. Again, just to reiterate, we can't say what would have happened to the zones if the enterprise zones had not been in existence. But the stated purpose in the statutes is to revitalize the areas, and so that was something that we could actually kind of look at. We can look at the data and we could say, was it effective in stopping the declining population? Was it effective in taking the unemployment rate that was below national rates, below the rate of the county, and did it change that in any way? And what we found is that it doesn't appear to have, or although there may be an effect, like Perry said, the effect wasn't large enough to show up as an improvement relative to the county or relative to the state.
So while we may not be making the improvements we hope for, we may be stemming the decline.
Could be.
Maybe. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Representative Ball.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Barry, in each one of your illustrations, as far as the benefit, it looks like it's had no positive gain or maybe an adverse effect in each one of those categories. Have either one of you done any study on the businesses that are located in these enterprise zones? How are the businesses performing?
We have not, and one of the difficulties there is we had, as I mentioned, some difficulty in actually trying to measure the economic well-being of people in the zone. It's even more difficult to isolate businesses within the zone. And short of being able to correct me if I'm wrong here, short of being able to actually go out and find businesses in the zones and really do an extensive sampling of those businesses, we wouldn't really be able to bring valid information on them.
Well, in your judgment, are these businesses staying in business, or are they just startups and dissolving and starting a new business? I mean, if in fact these are viable concerns, would they not be producing some tangible results for the community as far as economic well-being?
Well, basically what happens is, of course, they receive the tax credit. So the immediate benefit, or the immediate transfer of benefits goes initially to the employer, with the hope that that will result in additional investment, and that will result in jobs, and therefore translate into benefits for the residents of the area. And to achieve that, the incentives are specifically tied to employing people, for example, within the zone, or who are unemployed or on public assistance. So that's how it's set up to achieve that link. But what our research has shown is that typically what happens is that when the benefit initially goes to the firm, they don't substantially change their behavior. What happens is they tend to retain a great deal of those benefits. And that may be in the form of higher profits, for example. So in that way, it tends to benefit the businesses. Now, it does achieve some investment response. Certainly, the tax incentives basically reduce the cost of investing. So what happens is, because that's lower, we would expect that they would increase investment to some degree. But what we found at looking at data that's more general, not for the zones, but more general for the state, is that typically what happens is that response is not very large. And to a large extent, those purchases are made from out-of-state suppliers. For example, if you need a large piece of equipment, you may not be able to find somebody who supplies that in Kentucky. So I think we found over 80% of the purchases or additional investment is actually made outside of Kentucky in general. That's not specific for the zones, but that's in general. So the benefits seem to be going directly to the firms, and while there is some evidence that that leads over into an increase in personal income, that's largely lost to the zone.
If those firms were to buy equipment out of state and did not pay sales tax, would they still get the equivalent percentage of sales tax exemption off their profits, whether they paid it or not, if they purchased it out of state?
Well, if they purchased it out of state, and we had to look into this a little bit in terms of what the tax burden was. If it's delivered into the state, and correct me if I'm wrong, then they have to pay that sales tax. And then what happens is they turn in that certificate, and they're exempt, therefore, from that sales tax. But, to answer your question?
Yeah. One other question, Mr.
Sure.
Chairman. I think that what I heard you say earlier in the discussion is that really you don't know much that's happened in this thing this 20 years because very few people have been responding to your monitoring efforts, or the state's monitoring efforts, or whoever is doing the monitoring. But on page 5, when it mentions that all firms and property owners are eligible. Now, by property owners, does that require a resident property owner or just a property owner that is entitled to this the benefit.
I believe it's just a property owner. You don't have to be a resident.
So if I own property and these lots or distressed houses in these areas, Senator Symes' area, for example, or whoever, then I could take that credit if I refurbish and rebuild a house.
I believe so, but I'd want to check on that.
Well, that's not really the intent, I would think, of this act, is it?
Well, we can't really speak to the intent of the act, but
Well, I
there
understand
does
that.
seem to be some evidence that may occur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Representative Sims.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Either three of you can answer this question. On page 23, cost of enterprise zone program. With CRETA, KIDA, with all those, now, of course, I kept on reading and I noticed that that is the enterprise zones. How many years are we speaking of? And what kind of formula? Does this decrease the other counties that may be eligible for CRETA?
No, a firm can also, they can be in the enterprise zone program and also take advantage of the CRETA program if they're in a particular CRETA county, or the KIDA program if they're in a county that's covered by KIDA, and as well as if the KIDSTA program if they're in a particular county that applies to as well.
Just, so on page 23, it doesn't mean that that's just an enterprise zones that has collected that much money? The corporations or the
I think
businesses?
you're talking about, my page 23 may be different than yours.
It's got
Okay,
cost of
23
enterprise.
on the, I'm sorry, 23 on this particular
Over the years, 93 through 2002.
This is for, this information here is for 1993 through 2000. And this is a summary of the Kentucky Economic Development Programs over that time. The total incentives taken, as well as the wage assessments for those particular four programs, has been $252 million. Estimates provided by the Office of State Budget Director last year in their publication on the Enterprise Zone program, their estimate was that the total cost for this particular program has been $284 million.
How much difference would that be than, let's use Hart County, for instance, because we qualify for CRETA, or in a CRETA county. Does that affect the formula that you use for CRETA with the enterprise zones?
No.
Thank you.
I got to get through the fourth. Finish? Okay. Senator Borders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know we have a lot of territory to cover here in a short period of time, but I'd like to go back to Senator Harris's comment. I think that one thing we need to be very, very careful of here is, while it may appear that we're not making a lot of headway, that we would have to be able to some way take a crystal ball and go back and look and see what would have happened without that. For example, I was very appreciative that the Appropriations and Revenue Committee came to the Eastern Kentucky area to hear from our people there. But surely there must be occasions when you'll have a local steel industry which could very well move to its home plant in Ohio, that these considerations may indeed keep it there. And while we may not see the gains that we'd hoped to see, it could have been devastating to what's happened in some of our small towns. Like I have small towns in my district, they don't exist anymore. They're not there. We saw what happened to the towns 25, 30 years ago. Well, I would suggest that from the industry standpoint, this same thing could have happened. And I think while the previous report, we appropriately said, let's not make a decision until January or something, I think we need to be even more careful here because of the fact there are so many unknowns, and I appreciate the job that the folks in this committee always do, the staff and so forth. But I think we're pointing out that we just don't really fully understand yet all the impacts here. And while like in Hardin County, Representative Sims, there were many of us who met with the governor and wanted to do whatever it would take to bring that new automobile plant down there. and we would have spent hundreds of millions of dollars. Well, I think we need to also be sure that we retain, and you mentioned retention, that we don't fully understand how much the retention's been. And to have a refinery in your area that's spending hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars for environmental concerns and cleanup. They may say, oh, rusty refinery if we had not had these incentives, and one that just closed down. So I think we really got to be real cautious to what we put our stamp of approval or disapproval on in these months ahead as we look at this controversial issue, because I think it's controversial because we don't understand it. But I think if we go back and see the businesses that we are retaining, I would just submit that a business retained is equally too important to any new business we could bring into the state. And I'm all for economic development, but I know we'll be hearing more from Gina and that in just a little bit. But so I think there's a lot of considerations and some very good questions have been raised by the committee this morning, and points out we don't have all the answers, but I think it's very important that we started the dialogue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Palumbo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe I understood you to say that you had trouble determining the economic well-being in some of these areas. Is that correct?
By trouble, it's difficult to specifically measure the people that are in the zone because we don't have information at that detailed a level. So we had to use census tract information to approximate the people that live in the zones. So what you're getting with this data is census tract data that closely approximates what's happening within those zones.
And so that's, you use the census tract data to determine that 6 of the 10 zones didn't have improvement.
Well, I think that was with respect to the poverty rate, yes. One of the things to remember with the poverty rate, for example, and it's with these charts you kind of lose a little bit of information. I think it's easier for us to kind of work through them, but you kind of lose a little bit of information there. But you have to keep in mind that the poverty rate in the zones in 2000 on average was 29.5%. In the rest of the county, it was 11.8% on average. So to see a 2 or 3 percentage point change in the zone is not a very large change when you're looking at an average poverty rate of nearly 30%. And so the magnitudes of these variables is somewhat lost with the way I presented it. And I apologize for that, but I thought this might be the best way to take an overview of what's going on there.
But if I may, Mr. Chairman, a lot of these are inner city where we are spending years to overcome the poverty rate. I mean, whether there's an enterprise zone or not an enterprise zone, it's something we continue to work on. And so I feel like you probably did have trouble determining, and that perhaps if these enterprise zones weren't there, they might have 40%.
We don't know.
So that's just what I wanted to get at on the table. Thank you very much. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Russell County, Senator McGuire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In response, I guess, to Representative Ball, or I think it was he, who was asking about the businesses, and I think one of you stated that you had trouble identifying the businesses. Yes. In the report, there is a statement that says that 78% of the tax incentives in 2002 were taken by firms in Louisville. And there's also another one that says 20 firms accounted for 72% of the tax incentives provided in 2002. Are those 20 businesses identifiable?
Yes.
Okay. So if those 20 businesses are identifiable, then we are accounting for almost 75% of that particular tax incentive that has been given, correct?
That's self-reported data to the Enterprise Zone Authority.
Right.
Yes.
And that's part of the monitoring procedure, that there is a question mark, and everything is self-reported materials. I would like to, I would hope that we could also maybe give an opportunity, Mr. Chairman, maybe for a response for some of these businesses, that they might be able to, one of these 20 that might be able to come in or willing to come in and speak to us in regard to this. I'd like to hear that other side also.
Right. We are not going to adopt this report today. We are going to allow, if it's the next meeting or whenever we have the next meeting, opportunity for like the chamber or business community to come in and make some responses.
Thank you. I think that would be very appropriate. Yes. And there's a lot of, must have been a difficult report to work on. I know it's very subjective. The whole report is subjective, and a lot of material that you can't get your arms around, and it's hard to find documentation for. So as we grasp at straws to try to determine what is appropriate and isn't appropriate, and what's working and what isn't working, and as I read, with monitoring, how are you going to monitor when vendors, vendors are responsible for determining when or whether the individual or firm making the purchase is eligible for a tax exemption. The vendor is responsible for determining whether building materials will be used for remodeling, rehab, et cetera, et cetera. Gee. Just kind of holds. Okay. I appreciate it's not voting on that today. Thank you.
Yes, sir. All right, Senator Steins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Sims actually raised in my mind a question that I was wondering if you all could clarify for me. On that chart that she was referring to on page 23, that's in 33 of the book, there was a figure for the total enterprise zone cost, but that seems to contradict the figure that's in the executive summary on page V. That's a $169 million figure. Can you clarify for me why there's a discrepancy?
What it is that for this particular one, and we cite this in the report, is we didn't want to make an estimate of how much of those out-of-state sales would actually be subject to the use tax, and the Office of State Budget Director has done that in their January report of last year, and their estimate was that the program had cost $284 million, and so we wanted just to provide a context of here's what they've put out there, and here's what has also been reported for these other four firms. In our executive summary and everything, we stuck with the Kentucky Revenue Cabinet data.
And then the other thing that Representative Sims made me wonder is where she asked were there firms that might be eligible for more than one of these benefits here or options here. And I guess my question to you is was that potential overlap taken into consideration when you calculated if a firm is taking a credit and putting it in the enterprise zone column rather than putting it in the CRETA column?
There shouldn't be much overlap there, I don't think, and I have to investigate that a little bit more exactly on how each one of these were calculated. And I would be willing to, I'll get that information for you.
It's a similar problem to the other point that I raised, and I think we need to tease that out if we can. Thank you.
Okay, Representative Arnold.
Real quick information. Do we have a county or two counties in Kentucky that's is it a federal empowerment zone?
I believe in Somerset we do. I'm not for sure on that.
Yes.
Yeah, there's one in Somerset for sure.
That doesn't, they don't.
That's a different program.
Yeah.
It's a
But
federal program.
apparently a county could not be in both. Is that true or not?
Not sure.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, my senator from Russell.
That's not Somerset.
It's a Raleigh area.
That's Wayne and Clinton.
Yeah. Okay. All right. We're ready for a response from the cabinet. So Gene and Phyllis, whoever else you would have want to bring to the table.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. We're here today to respond to this report. Phyllis Browning, who's the director of the Enterprise Zone Program, will do that, and then we'll be glad to answer any questions we can for the committee.
Okay.
Good morning. As Jean says, my name's Phyllis Bruning, and I do administer the Enterprise Zone program and have for about the last 4.5 years for the cabinet, along with my assistant. You have a copy of our written response there, and I just want to briefly summarize that for you. The program is governed by 11 board members, myself and my assistant. Since the inception of the program in 1983, the board has certified over 4,100 companies in the program. To date, we have a little over 2,000 of them that are still active. During the first 15 years of the program, monitoring was responsible for 1,100 decertifications of businesses. But since fiscal year 2000, through the end of 2002, we have decertified the same number of businesses, almost 1,100 businesses in the last 3 years. This was a result of our enhanced monitoring of the program through regulations that were approved in February of 2000. These amended regulations were the result of both a combined effort of our cabinet, the Revenue Cabinet, and the Department for Employment Services. We all met and developed those regulations. The Enterprise Zone program, as stated in the research report, does pose a number of monitoring issues, which the Cabinet agrees are issues that need to be addressed. And although we have enhanced our monitoring efforts over the last 4 years, we are committed to our efforts to work with Revenue and DES to examine these issues and see where we can go forward in the future with those. I will not address all the 6 of the recommendations, but we will be happy to answer any direct questions you have.
Senator McGee.
Ms. Bruning, the decertifications that have occurred, what's the most common reason for the decertification?
Failure to respond. We send out, our regulations say that we send out a monitoring report in the month the business is certified. As you can see with the volume that we have, to try to send out one mass mailing at one time would be a very large task. So we broke it down to do it in the month that the business was certified. So that allowed us to make it, we send out anywhere from 100 to 180 monitoring letters a month. They get that, they have 30 days to respond to us. If they don't, we send them a second notice by certified mail as our regulations require. And then they have 60 days to answer that. So if they don't do that, then we go to the board and we say they didn't respond. And then we let Revenue know that these were the ones who did not, because the penalty for that is they have to pay back anything that they have collected for which they've not responded to us for, or if they have never responded to monitoring, then it goes all the way back to the date that they were certified. So, but a large number are for that reason. The next one would be for those failing to meet the 25% targeted workforce.
Okay, that was going to be a follow-up. So that actually for the ones who do not respond, they actually have a 90-day window.
That's correct.
A 30 and the 60 to respond.
Correct.
To that.
Mm-hmm.
But the primary infraction then would be not complying with the 25% workforce.
That would be the next area where the large numbers. There's some that just refuse our certified mail. There's some that because they may have been certified 18 years ago, they've gone or they've moved and they've not told us and we're not able to find them. We work with both the local zone administrators, as Senator Simon said, each zone has a local person that I have talked with and submits the applications, and we'll work with them and the Department for Employment Service offices to see if these businesses are still there and where they're located, to try to find them.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Arnold.
I think you've answered part of my question, but if they're decertified, you say they're subject to repaying the tax?
Depending on the reason for decertification. If they are decertified for failure to meet the targeted workforce, then they are no longer eligible from the date the board decertifies them forward. They're no longer eligible. If a company is decertified for failure to responding to us, they didn't answer the first monitoring letter we sent, and they didn't answer the certified monitoring letter, and we get the card receipt back that says we know they received it, and they still don't respond, then we let Revenue know that these people are this company is decertified for that reason, and then we give them the date either of their last monitoring report received or the date of their certification.
What is their success rate of recouping those Texas?
That answer I do not know, because that is revenues. That was something in the regulations that is revenues.
Well, I'm not on the witch hunt here, but what if an individual buys equipment and he gets the tax break and then moves within the county but out of the enterprise zone and continues to do business? Is there any way to?
There's nothing in the statute or the regs that allow us to go back and make him pay that back. If he purchased it at the time he was located in the zone, and then 6 months later moved his business outside the zone, it does not make them pay anything back. So we would catch them on the next monitoring to find out that they moved
You think
out of
it?
the zone.
Would you make that? Does the board make a suggestion that we visit that issue?
That could be an issue to be looked at, yes.
Okay.
There are many businesses that move out of the zone or just go out of business.
Well, it's gonna be,
I can see going out of business if you're failure, but if you just
Move.
get a break on your equipment and you move out of the zone and you're competing with another person that's had to pay the tax, it's really unfair. Thank you.
Senator Syme.
yes, these 11 board members, are they paid?
They get compensation, $100 a meeting, and then their expenses.
And I assume the 11 board members are, I guess, regional or around the state, through the state?
That's correct. Now, 3 of those are representatives of cabinets.
Okay. There's a recommendation, at least from on high, that we do away with enterprise zones, that the state would be better off revenue-wise. Does this board have a recommendation as to whether or not we keep the enterprise zone or do away with it?
The board has not made a suggestion to me either way.
It's interesting. You think they might. It'd be interesting as to what the board's recommendation is. I also find it rather interesting that as a legislator, I don't know that I've heard from a board member pro or con on this issue. So talking to my local fellow up there, it's my understanding that we have 1,500 companies, big and small, located in the enterprise zone in Jefferson County. Do you communicate with them annually, bi-monthly, or how do you?
Pretty continuously, we communicate. They come to the meetings. The board meets every other month. We meet 6 times a year. The Louisville zone administrator is at every meeting. Some of the other zone administrators, because of distance-wise, and if they don't have applications.
And there's a meeting monthly or something?
We meet every other month, 6 times a year.
Has this board communicated to these 1,500 people, CEOs in my county, that there's a potential that enterprise zones could go away? Red flag type thing or anything?
To my knowledge, the board has not. In particular, in the Louisville area, we did have, I should say, the local zone administrator had put on we had a public meeting where we went and we spoke to them and explained to them what the program was. And at that time, and when I get phone calls from businesses, I explain to them that the current law in the Jefferson expires at the end of 2003.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Representative Palumbo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In dealing with the businesses, do you work with the Secretary of State's office before somebody's decertified to find out if they've renewed their business
We use
papers?
their website. We do check the website to make sure. In fact, on our application, we even tell the businesses, this is something that is necessary for you to be in good standing, that no taxes can, be owed or anything like that. So I don't verbally communicate with them unless I can't find something on the website that I'm not sure of, then I'll call them, but yes, we do.
And how are the members of the Enterprise Zone Authority appointed?
By the governor. It's set out by statute, the groups that they represent, and then there's 3 state representatives, our cabinet, workforce development, and revenue.
Thank you.
Representative Ball.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief. Is it Ms. Bruner?
Bruni.
Bruni. In order for a business to be certified, does it have to be a single site business or can have multiple locations?
Can have multiple locations in the zone, and if they have them out of the zone, we are very specific to make sure we get the locations where they are. And so if they have more, if they're in the zone administrator is the one who tells us these locations are in the zone. And in our regulations, we then define how we do that, because we give them a separate certificate to indicate each location, and then we give them a location number. So example, if a company has 4 locations, then they're given an easy number with a 1, 2, 3, and 4 behind it, so that we know and that revenue knows they have multiple locations in the zone.
Is there any control as to judging or measuring how much equipment is bought for one business having to be in an enterprise zone versus the other branches that are not in the enterprise zone?
No, sir.
So in fact, if I had 2 businesses or 2 locations, I could buy all my equipment for both businesses through the branch that's in the enterprise zone?
That is a potential problem, yes.
Is it a real problem or a potential problem?
I'm not sure. I don't go out and go to the businesses with as many as there are. Now, we are going to implement that and start site visits to businesses.
Well, I'm not suggesting that businesses would be dishonest, but the fact of life is sometimes those things happen, and I just wondered if there's any way to monitor or to check that if you had in the same county, for example, and you had different branches, if there was a disproportionate amount of equipment bought in an enterprise zone versus a non-enterprise zone, it might be something to look at.
It could be, yes.
Thank you very much.
Any other, Senator McGee? Hey.
Representative Ball hit my point exactly. I was going to ask you, there is nothing in the monitoring system that we have to preclude Plant A located outside of a zone and having Plant B located in a zone, or buying their equipment there and using it outside of the zone.
That's correct. I mean, we advise the businesses, send them the information that says these purchases must be made for equipment that is used in the zone. But aside from going out there physically and watching them put it in, we do not have a mechanism to be sure that they are buying that and putting it actually at that location and opposed to the other location.
It would appear to me there are some loopholes. Monitoring system.
Thank you. This is the gentleman from Russell. Any other comments? Hey, well, thank you for being here. You.
I have a gentleman.
Okay, Senator Stein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This really isn't for the cabinet. This is really more for staff. I really sympathize with you guys. As I was reading this report, I almost had the feeling that we had asked you to do what is perhaps impossible. As I perused the report, there were various comments like, let's see, the economic studies indicate that the effects of enterprise zone programs are hard to measure and difficult to isolate from other factors. In measuring enterprise zone performance, it's difficult to control for outside influences. These 3 techniques have been unable to establish conclusively the benefits of enterprise zones. Accurate and complete cost data have been unavailable to researchers. When cost data has been available, the cost per job can be estimated, but the cost per zone resident job remains difficult to quantify. Could neither determine the cost nor the benefits. This was from the Lambert and Coombs study. Their conclusion was, we don't know, it looks like, in so many words. CFG noted the difficulty of developing an estimate of the fiscal impacts. It seems that the report really is here's another. There are not consistent procedures in place to verify that individuals live in the enterprise zones. It really looks like we gave you a very difficult task. I guess my overall observation from having read this, though, is with the inavailability or unavailability of data, it really is hard to draw any reasonable conclusions from what I could tell, and it appears to me that really what we need to do is tighten up the monitoring in particular, but also, as is certainly well pointed out by other members of the committee, maybe clean up some of these loopholes. and it would certainly be my my hope that we could do that rather than throw it out, because of the points that I think were also made, and that is, but for this program, who knows what would have happened in many of these sort of inner city areas that are very needful. So that's my observation. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you. And I do want to thank the Kim for being here today. And once again, I thank the staff for your work. It's like trying to grab a hold of a big puff of smoke out there. And it's difficult to do, and you'll always come through. We appreciate that so much. We would not, as I mentioned, be taking any type of action on the report today. At the next meeting of the committee, it's assumed that we'll have an opportunity for the Chamber of Commerce, State Chamber of Commerce business to come back and make some kind of response. There has been a request made to LRC that our next meeting would be January 16th. At 10 o'clock. That has yet to be approved, and of course at that time there's also was the topic was to be medical malpractice insurance, and so that concludes business. We're adjourned. Yes.
Mr. Chairman, there is one more item of business. Even though we may be meeting in January, we hope you'll be eating fruit in January, sir.
Hey, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. You all.
To one of the best co-chairmen this committee's ever seen.
Well, thank you very much.
We
Thank you
appreciate all your efforts.
I appreciate this, and I really do care for you all. And you know I care for this committee. I think it's a solid committee, and I wish you well. You got a lot of areas to work with in the future, and I'll be following you in the paper. Take care. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
I guess you got all your shopping done. I thought I was the only one that didn't make a house famous. When they relocated all those people around there, I'm amazed that it didn't get violent. I mean, somebody just didn't lose it over there.
Yeah. I think everybody decided we'll take the money and go.
I think your comments on it.
You may no longer be the
Yeah, it's present or future. I would be local taxes overhead. Yeah, I think I'm pretty much leaning right. I think I've got, that's got to finalize it in my mind now. Hey, what's going on? Good to see you, sir. Oh, God.